Welcome back to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels. That's right, the City of Angels, and a very hot city at that. Now, today is a very special show for you. Many of you know about Roswell. As a matter of fact, you have to be living under a rock if you don't know about Roswell. As we are in the 20th year of the 21st century, you know about Roswell, you know about Area 51, and you probably know some other names, maybe S4, maybe the Aztec crash. What about before Roswell? How many people talk about crashes and retrievals before Roswell, which happened in July 1947? Well, I know of at least one that happened in the mainland United States. And fortunately for us, we have the guest who is the guy to speak to on this topic. So let me introduce him first, and then we'll talk about the case. I'm going to introduce the one and only Mr. Paul Blake Smith. Mr. Smith, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me on, and good evening, all listeners. I think we got a terrific story for you.
I concur. I definitely concur. Now, let's go back to 41, am I right?
That's right.
Let's go back to that year, and what month was it?
This would have been early to mid-April of 41.
Okay, and now I've heard the case from the Cape Girardeau, Missouri case, told by Stanton Friedman asking, I believe it was the granddaughter, Charlotte McCann, something like that?
Right.
Okay, and she relayed the story that her grandfather heard the crash or saw the crash, and he came there to administer the last rites. Was that the case?
That's correct. She learned the story from her dying grandmother in the early 1980s. So she put everything together, and she checked with her sister, and there was some confirmation of this. It's an amazing story in itself, the family legacy. She wrote it down, typed it up, and sent it to a UFO investigator you may have heard of named Ray Fowler.
Yes, absolutely.
And he passed it along to Leonard Stringfield, who passed it along to Stanton Friedman. And they wrote a little bit about it, but Dr. Friedman, God bless his soul, he came to Cape Girardeau, and he did actual on-the-ground research looking into this story. Then Stan brought in Ryan S. Wood and Robert Wood, and they got into it, and they produced enough material to make a sci-fi channel special called The Secret Evidence That We Are Not Alone. And they spent about 2 minutes on the Cape Girardeau tale and reenacted a little of what happened. And that really helped to bring some more national consciousness to the story. But as the years went by, I began wondering, where is a book on this? I want to read a book. I want every detail since I lived in Cape Girardeau for my first 35 years. And I admit, I did not hear the story when I lived there. It was only when I moved away that I began to learn of this. So, frustrated, I decided to write my own.
Now, let me ask you this. If you lived in Cape Girardeau for your first 35 years, and you said you didn't learn about this till Stanton Friedman came down?
Right. Basically, I first learned of it around the year 2000 when your old buddy Art Bell had a Coast to Coast AM with Linda Moulton Howe, and she was going over the story of Ryan Wood and Stanton Friedman and their investigation, and Charlotte Huffman Mann's letter about what happened in the family. And I thought, wow, I recognize all this. Obviously, it's my hometown, but I've never heard this story before. I checked with my father. He had honestly not lived, or he had lived in Cape Girardeau at the time. He was about 6 years old, but he had not heard the story. My stepmother blurted out, I heard the story when I was in high school in the 1960s. So, you know, Charlotte's letter is all very nice in the 80s, or by the early 90s, I guess. But there was a couple of people that I heard from, they said, oh, yes, I remember that crazy-sounding story. I'm sure from 1941 to the 60s and 70s, there was so little investigation, so little information that people might have thought it was just wacky that somebody's playing a hoax or something. But when the stories start paralleling, adding up, there really is something to this tale.
Now, let me ask you this. As we know, Stanton Friedman did not even know about the fact or the details about Roswell until he interviewed Jesse Marcel Sr. I've spoken to his son before he died. It's unfortunate the senior didn't live to tell us his story to these days, but hey, at least we have a lot of memories of him. But the point being is, until that interview in Louisiana between Stanton Friedman and Jesse Marcel, Stanton had no idea there actually had been a crash, a retrieval
Yeah.
that was in possession of the United States. So
Yeah.
6 years before this happens, let me ask you this. How was this hidden so well?
That's part of the tale in that the military came in and told everyone immediately, put down that evidence, we'll take that camera film and the photos, and you are never to speak of this ever again. And in those days, pre-World War II for us, people did what their government told them, basically. Most people I've found kept their mouths shut. They were afraid to talk. A few people did whisper the tale, and it did leak out. But overall, if you were told directly, given a stern lecture, and the FBI was on the scene, you were pretty intimidated back in those days, and you hushed up pretty quick. I'll point out that in those days, to this day, Cape Girardeau was the hub of a national armory where the Army trains. Harry S. Truman lived in Cape Girardeau in 1906 and trained in the National Guard Armory and trained on the banks of the Mississippi River and how to rappel and climb rocky cliffs and cross the river and all of that good stuff. So that gives you an example of there were citizens in Cape who were affiliated with the Army. The Army had just come in and told people to keep quiet. So if you were talking, you were afraid of, the baker, the butcher, the doctor, the lawyer, anybody next door might have been affiliated with the National Guard, the Army, and would have told on you. So that was another incentive to keep your mouth shut.
Especially in 1941. Let's set the setting for everyone. This is in the midst of World War II. We're in the European theater, and this is right before we're attacked in Hawaii. So we're not in the Pacific theater quite yet, right? We're actually in the European theater. So that I would think that more people, like you said earlier, if the government tells you to shut up, people actually listened.
Right. There was a great concern amongst FDR's administration, people on both sides of the political fence, that we're going to get drawn into World War II in Europe. The Nazis are just running roughshod, and inevitably they're going to attack America if we don't get involved. It was a huge controversy by April of 41. We were not involved yet. That became the case when Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th. But at that time, we were supposedly remaining neutral, but supplying Great Britain with tanks and guns and such to fend off Nazi bombardment. But it was very tenuous, and it looked like almost at any time that they sank one of our ships, the Nazis, that we would be inevitably drawn into this directly. So it's interesting to note that the Cape Girardeau area had a great German contingent. They were mostly farmers, but I found out there was a church service in town that was in German because there were so many German people. And most of them were loyal to the United States of America, but there were a few what you call Bundists who were pro-Nazi. And the FBI was so concerned, they opened up a field office in Cape Girardeau 1 month before the crash. They were investigating some sabotage at factories and spying, espionage rings right there in my hometown. So there was more going on than I realized, and yet another incentive for the military and that FBI agent to start swearing people to secrecy. We can't let the Nazis find out what we've found here and maybe use it in propaganda or to try to steal this crashed disc from us and weaponize it. It was our prerogative to do as we felt with it. FDR felt it was a top state secret, and he wanted to weaponize it himself.
Possibly as the Manhattan Project, we don't ever know at this point, but I wonder if that was the basis to start thermonuclear fission at that point. Obviously, we don't know.
We were investigating that. Our top scientist, led by Dr. Vannevar Bush, and he was apparently notified of the Cape Girardeau crash. I say apparently because just a few days after the crash, I checked FDR's records, and Dr. Bush was brought into the Oval Office for a closed-door, off-the-record meeting. Only FDR, Dr. Bush, and the top medical man of the country, the Surgeon General. And as I talked to Ryan Wood about this case, he said that would have been FDR discussing an autopsy of the bodies with the Surgeon General and the craft with his top scientist who was working on, nuclear fission and trying to develop the atom bomb first. So there was a nuclear, apparently, propulsion device, and it might well have been applied to our atomic bomb research and perfected things. I know that sounds pretty wild, but you'd have to read my book and understand the issues of the time a little better. I'm not saying absolutely, but it looks like it could well have been the case. I'll give you another quick story. An atomic scientist in the early 60s was at a nuclear bomb detonation, a test detonation in America. And according to a witness who was there, they were playing cards waiting for this bomb to go off. And they said, "Where did we get the technology for all of this?" And the scientist blurted out, "Oh, we got it from a downed spacecraft in southeast Missouri back in the 40s. Well, he said in the Ozarks in the 40s. And it's like, well, there's a shocking admission that gives you another clue that what was found in that crash was applied to the atomic bomb research that was ongoing at the time.
The irony is if this happened today and someone said that this would be on the mainstream news, people would jump in and say, wow, we have proof. But 79 years ago, people would have laughed it off. So for someone of that senior level to say that, I could see why people would actually say, hey, this is serious because that's where it came from. And let me ask you this, because we can't really tell what the ETs were looking for, but we do know because of Roswell being the only nuclear armament in the world, and that's presumably why they were inspecting the area. You mentioned that Cape Girardeau was also an army town, right, where Truman grew up in, right?
Well, he grew up across the state, but he spent the summer of 1906 in Cape, and he campaigned there the previous fall, just a few months before the crash. He was at the U.S. Capitol building, which comes in later in our story, getting ready for some military funding hearings that he wanted to interview top military officials and FDR's administrative people on why our budget is getting out of control with the military. And one of those that he interviewed the Monday morning after the crash was General George C. Marshall. I checked his records. He was FDR's most trusted Army Chief of Staff, and he was on a tour of various bases around the country, military bases. Suddenly, the same night, I feel, of the crash, his military tour stopped. He still had two more bases to go to, and he seemed grounded and as if he can't go anywhere. And his records only show up that he turned up publicly at Harry Truman's confab in the Capitol on Monday, and then he met with President Roosevelt on Tuesday. So it fits the narrative that the crash may have happened around sunset on April 12th, a Saturday night, just before Easter. And there's another reason I feel that is a fairly accurate date, and that's President Roosevelt's personal appointment log at the White House. You can still visit that at his presidential library online. Digitized records show the president was up way past his bedtime, which is normally around 10:30 or so. He was up past midnight, and he could have been taking and placing calls, asking what the devil is going on. What are these rumors of a spaceship with little people crashing in Missouri, and what do we do with this? They would have gone straight to the top of the Army chain of command, to the commander-in-chief, so that makes sense too.
Now, you said Saturday, April 12th around sunset in Cape Girardeau, Missouri is when it happened. Now, can you describe, before we get to the actual setting of where it crashed, let's talk about the size of the ship, and was it a typical flying saucer, or as some people see, rectangles, or even large squares or triangles even?
Basically, Reverend Huffman was the only one who gave any great or even a small description of the craft. I would imagine that if it was huge, he would have said so. Or if it was tiny, he would have said so. But I'm thinking it was like 40 feet around in circumference. He said it was a circular silver disc, just like your typical flying saucer that we think of in sci-fi movies and comic books and such of the era and to this day. He said it was cracked open, and he walked over and took a little look inside and saw a chair or two, a little seat that would have been about the size for a human child. He saw some like gauges and dials, or like a dashboard or a cockpit flight deck, as we would call it today. And he saw a silver band around the top center of the cockpit of the disc, and he said there was strange hieroglyphic type writing that he could not understand imprinted in this silver band. So before he could even get a better look, the military came in and said, "Get away from there, put down all the debris," because it had the craft had sort of exploded on impact. And the farm property's owner, or a farm hand, one of the two, had called in to the Cape Girardeau Fire Department saying, "There's been a crash. I think it's an airplane. It was on its way to the airport," which was not too far away. And he saw the fireball. From my research, he had to go through an operator who patched him in to the fire department, and they sent as many first responders as they could, and there was a fire in the field around the spaceship, and it had to be put out, and there were little shards or shrapnel debris of a strange metallic type. And it's interesting to know that a Cape Girardeau fireman said he was, his grandson said his grandfather was on his deathbed with cancer, and that he said, "You know that spaceship crash story in Cape Girardeau? That story's actually true. I was there. I was fighting the fire. I saw the bodies. The military came in. They swore us to secrecy, and they caught me trying to stick some debris in my pocket." And he said they kicked me out of the site. They took the debris back and threw me out. And they said, the grandson said the grandfather confessed in the aftermath, in the days, maybe weeks afterwards, he felt his phone was tapped, and he was being watched around town to see if he would commit any acts of vengeance for being booted out of the crash site and dressed down in front of others. So there's another story we can't exactly confirm because I can't find any fire records. They were all tossed out, I was told, from 1941. But, and also, if you were the military and the FBI, would you even allow them to make a crash report, a fire call record of things, or would you take it away and make sure no one ever heard about this?
Oh, you'd want no record, absolutely. And let me say something about the firefighter when he passed away in his deathbed. In law, I'm sure you know this, we have what's called a dying declaration, which basically posits that if you're about to die and you know it, the last statement you're going to say is generally going to be the truth. You're not going to mislead someone before you pass through the other side,
right,
which is why it's accepted. So that's why now we have a lot more people that are passing away that are telling us the stories from the 40s, 50s, 60s, and that era. I pay attention to a lot of them. Now, let me turn something interesting to you with this firefighter. Have you heard in the 1990s there was a federal firefighter's manual, and what it had was a scenario, a chapter, what to do if firefighters came in contact with a crashed UFO.
No, I have not heard that. What year did you say that was?
It was sometime in the 1990s, possibly 94. But the reason I bring it up is because that book or that chapter was supposedly modeled after the Missouri crash.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. That sounds vaguely familiar. What to do in the event of extraterrestrial materials and such in a fire and how to fight it. I can believe that. The Roswell crash seemed to happen out in the desert with no witnesses, and if there was a fire, I don't recall reading about it, but Cape Girardeau did produce a fireball and flames, and it would have been very important if you lived on a farm. If you got a wooden house and a wooden barn, as they were in those days, you want that fire put out pretty quick, and you would call the fire department partly to, as a humanitarian gesture, to get people that you felt were on the flight medical help, but also put out this fire and save our house.
Absolutely, and not to mention you have the barn, you have the farm, and what about the crops? You lose
Yeah.
everything in that fire. I think this is pre-insurance here at that matter too. 1941. I don't think very many farmers had insurance on their crops.
I agree. They would have been pretty young and green on April 12th, though, coming out of the ground. But I quite agree with your statement on deathbed confession. What purpose would it possibly have served for Grandpa, who's lying ill with cancer, to gather the family around and say, well, I was part of this UFO crash, and then start making up stuff or make up some crazy lie before you died? That would be about the opposite thing you would want to do, unless you just hated your family and wanted to fool them, or you felt you wanted attention. It doesn't jibe. You would tell the truth, and you would try to pass this along to keep it in the family before the story dies out. And that's what happened with Reverend Huffman, who died in 1959, by the way.
Now, when Reverend Huffman came to the scene with the crashed disc and looked inside and he saw the dead bodies and the hieroglyphics, was any of them barely clinging to life or were they all completely dead?
Reverend Huffman said that he was called and went with someone associated with the police department. In my research, I found out the Cape Girardeau Justice of the Peace lived right across the street. You look out your window and you're looking right down on Reverend Huffman's house. And the Justice of the Peace is associated with the police department on various cases, including sudden tragic deaths where you have to make sure that property involved has to be dispersed and handled in a proper legal manner. So they thought it was an airplane crash, so it makes perfect sense. And he said the car came and got him, an unmarked car, and they drove about 12 or 13 miles outside of Cape and went to the flames. They could see the fire and the fire department, and they stepped across a fence and got across this field, and there were 3 bodies stretched out side by side by side. And apparently one of the witnesses said that he pulled the bodies out of the craft and laid them out that way with their backs on the ground, their heads facing upward. And yes, they were your typical big-headed grays with big black eyes, long, thin arms and legs, like 3 fingers and 1 long thumb per hand, pretty creepy looking, and very crinkly skin, which might have been a flight suit or a combination thereof when you have material that's kept inside like a perfectly air-conditioned craft to your body specifications, and then it's suddenly cracked open and you're exposed to the oxygen-rich atmosphere of the Earth. You're going to be in big trouble, and it might physically affect your skin and your senses, and whether the crash killed the aliens or they died just before the crash, I don't know. However, Reverend Huffman said one of the bodies was still breathing, still respirating on the ground. So he kneeled over it and started to say his prayers to pray for the soul of these creatures. He made sure not to touch them, he said. And the one that was still technically alive stopped breathing and appeared to have gone limp and dead, which was, very sad, but it's understandable. There were no visible injuries to any of these 3 identical creatures. They looked like they were punched out of a Jell-O mold. All of them looked alike, with just maybe a little tiny dot or 2 for nostrils and a tiny little slit for a mouth and no ears, huge black eyes. If you've ever seen footage of Skinny Bob...
I'm so glad you brought that up. I'm so glad you brought that up.
Just like him, it sounds like. Yeah.
It's ironic you mentioned that, because after this I was going to bring that up, and if you hadn't seen it, going to send you that to say, is this what Reverend Huffman saw? Because to me, I've actually gotten confirmation from a couple different people that do not know each other that have been taken, that have said, I've asked them, have you ever seen any footage of any ETs online that look anything like the creatures that took you? And more than one person, 3 people that do not, 2 who don't know the third, said that they looked like Skinny Bob. And another person, a 4th person, was actually Richard Doty. He was in the Air Force Office of Special Investigation, and he said in 1980, after an extraterrestrial event at Kirkland Air Force Base, he was briefed into the ET program, and he was shown 20 minutes of footage. And then he said about a minute of the footage has been leaked online. And I asked him, is it the Skinny Bob footage? He said he didn't know. He'd have to see it. Afterwards, I sent it to him, and he said, yes, that's exactly it. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because to me, that's the basis to compare.
I quite agree. It's eerie that the description matches, and the creature in the video, his forehead seems to pulse a bit, and his eyelash or his eyelid seems to go down, and his head looks down, his eyes look down, and he looks up and looks around. I'm not a CGI expert, but I read online a guy who said, I am a CGI expert, and this is not computer-generated imagery. This is the real deal. It's a grainy black and white footage. Some say it's from 1942, taken by the KGB in Russia. I don't know if that's true, but it looks about that era. So we weren't the only country being visited in the early 40s, evidently.
That's true. As a matter of fact, prior to the 40s, in 1938, supposedly in Germany, the Black Forest, there was another crash. I don't know much other than to know that it was 1938 and it was the Black Forest near Berlin. But again, like you said, clearly during World War I and World War II, we were being observed. And I would think if I was a species looking onto humans who are fighting to kill each other, I'd be looking with interest saying, okay, what's going on here and why are they killing each other?
Yes, you have to remember, we were about up to the most important and fascinating part in human history, really. Our technology and our knowledge is just exploding from the early 40s forward, and so have conflicts where it's pretty clear good versus evil is taking place on the planet. The Nazi regime is mass murdering people to get what they want in taking over Europe, and the Japanese are doing the same in the Pacific, and their efforts would be accelerated as of Pearl Harbor in December. But as of April of 41, America was still neutral. But you would want to come here and start watching, almost like attending a baseball game and sitting in the stands if you were aliens, maybe taking a few samples and observing from a distance and watching this struggle going on planet Earth. It does make sense that you would want to be there at the dawn of the atomic age.
And also, the 40s also produced the technology for Sputnik, which ended up being the technology for Apollo, right?
That might well be true. The Russians made a lot of advances, and that made America very nervous, so we accelerated our space program and our weapons program, and it became an atomic race for the most weapons, the most deadly weapons, and who can test the most weapons and start poisoning our atmosphere in the late 40s and 50s. And thankfully there was a test ban treaty that was signed on to. But all of this was just getting underway, and the Russians had some amount of technology. The Germans may have had an atomic bomb program that was slowly coming together. It was just a huge race, and we needed anything. We were not looking too good as of April 41. Our military was way behind and woefully unprepared for battle, as rather proven by the Pearl Harbor attack, where we were caught with our pants down and really crippled. The Germans were refining attacks, blitzkriegs, and invasions, and the Russians were trying to fight them, and the Japanese, and we needed anything we could get our hands on to start fighting back as we would inevitably be pulled in to the conflict.
And also the technology that the Germans had, the Luftwaffe, the airplanes, weren't they even far more advanced than ours could be, flying faster and higher altitudes?
In those days, yes, indeed. It's sad but true. America, after World War I, went into a bit of a lull, and the Great Depression crippled our ability to manufacture and put people to work. And in 1941, it looked like we were going to end up in the war, so the economy did pick up. And it was a pretty strong year because we were opening factories and making bombs and bullets and such airplane parts for the British. But after Pearl Harbor, that all changed. We started making them for ourselves. And I found out, much to my surprise, in downtown Cape Girardeau, we had a secret factory for producing something called wire round resistors. It was a key component that was used in communications and weapons, and we had admirals and generals visiting the plant in secret during World War II. If it had anything to do with the technology taken from this farm field outside of town, I don't know. But it just seems like this is an eerie coincidence, because the factory was within a short walk, you could almost crawl, to the local Freemason lounge, or their headquarters in Cape Girardeau in those days, where Harry Truman had just attended some meetings during his fall 1940 campaign. And he was the Grand Master Freemason for the state of Missouri. I think Freemasons are good people. My grandfather himself was a Freemason in Iowa and St. Louis, and I'm very proud of him. I just point out the Freemason part because they keep so many secrets. And this is another factor in keeping this story clamped down, that you didn't want to violate the Brotherhood of Freemasonry by letting this slip out. The mayor of Cape Girardeau was not only a Freemason, he was Knights Templar. And that's a very advanced special Freemasonry. And FDR and his vice president and almost everyone in his cabinet were Freemasons. It's almost as if you couldn't get a job in FDR's government without being part of that secret brotherhood. So they wanted to keep secrets, and they had secret handshakes and passwords and other things, and it would have been a factor in, could you keep a lid on this? This is just between us. So the Cape Girardeau affair from 41 just didn't explode on the national scale like it should have, like Roswell gradually did 6 years later.
You know, let me ask you real quick about the Freemasons. I've noticed that there's been a few History Channel specials that have pointed out that George Washington and some of the early founders of the United States were wearing Freemason garb, Freemasonry garb. So right. That posits to me that we have probably a couple hundred years worth of presidents that were in the Freemasons, that were Masons.
Right, a secret society. Just a few weeks before the Cape Girardeau crash, Harry Truman gave a radio address praising his hero, Freemason George Washington. You can even see paintings and descriptions of George Washington as he went to Washington, D.C., and helped with the excavation and a ceremony for Freemasonry in digging the U.S. Capitol building. And they dug it way, way down below the surface. It's a huge structure. There's actually more square footage below the surface level, with the two houses of Congress, than there are above. And where did the Cape Girardeau UFO material end up? As I point out in my book, it may well have been stuck in a vault, a locked room, about 7 floors below the U.S. Capitol building. That's where another man reported seeing it, and I got a phone call a couple of years ago from a fellow who was, his father was in FDR's administration, and he said, one day, at the last day of school, I went to see my father, and he took me on the little underground train that ran through the Capitol. We got out and walked down into the U.S. Capitol sub-basement, and he went over to a room and opened it up, and there were these 3 dead aliens in 3 glass jars and silver spaceship shrapnel and pieces, the sections of the craft, and it matches Cape Girardeau perfectly. And as mentioned, Harry Truman was a Freemason. President Roosevelt, a Freemason. Henry Wallace, the vice president, was a 33rd degree Freemason who kept an office in the Capitol building. So where would you take the Cape Girardeau crash recovery in those days? If you were Freemasons, you were obsessed with such secrets and prizes, and where would you hide it, where it would be guarded and no one would know? Well, it starts to make sense that you cut it up in sections and stashed it about 7 stories below the U.S. Capitol building, at least for a while.
Yeah, again, like you said, where other Masons would keep the secret. And I'm glad you brought that up about the U.S. Capitol, of it possibly being the repository, because I would have asked, is it at Wright-Patterson, as a lot of people speculated Roswell ended up being, or Area 51, which other people say that was built after Roswell. But again, this is 6 years prior, and it makes sense that Truman, Roosevelt, and basically the Brotherhood would want it near them, especially if they want to keep a close watch on it.
That's a good point. You would want to kind of see if the heat dies down, so to speak. Is anything else going to happen? Are the aliens going to come back and ask for their fallen brethren, these 3 dead bodies? Wouldn't they want those back? Well, apparently nothing happened, and I think after maybe, let's say, 2 months, just to guess, I think the materials, the debris of the ship at least, were shipped to Wright-Patterson, where they had quite an advanced metallurgical laboratory and possibly some underground facilities there. I was just reading about this morning. A man confessed that, yes, the Roswell crash materials were brought here. It was a fairly open secret when I worked there. He was an old-timer who's retiring, and he says, I want to get this off my chest in this news story that I was reading just today. And I would bet 6 years before that, Cape Girardeau material was taken there at least eventually in 1941. We've got to start figuring out what this material was made of, how can we replicate it and turn it into either a weapon or an airplane or some material that would help us in defense of our nation. And we would not have just kept it on ice, locked up in a room, I don't think, in the Capitol for all that long.
Yeah, exactly. We would try to replicate it and use it. Now, I'm going to bring another figure into this just to compare and maybe to ask your opinion. I'm sure you've heard of Bob Lazar, right?
Sure.
And when he gave his interview on Joe Rogan a little over a year ago, one interesting thing he said there that he did not say in the documentary that was produced by my friend Jeremy Corbell is that he believes that the aircraft or the spacecraft, that one, the sports model, and the others are taken out approximately every 8 to 10 years. See where material sizes lie, and if they can make any improvements, they do on figuring out how to replicate it. If they don't, they put everything back, wait another decade or so, and then come back and look at it. That makes sense to me because you got 1941, we're 79 years later. I would think every so many years as we get higher in our technology, we'd look at it and be like, hey, wait a second, can we replicate this now?
One of the most interesting facets of Bob Lazar's statements are not just the craft and what made it run, but he said he was shown some data, some like intelligence files one day, and they had details on where these extraterrestrials came from and what they looked like. I think he said he saw some like autopsy photographs, and where did we get this information from? How did we learn that? Unless we've had some contact with a living, communicating extraterrestrial who was friendly. I find it hard to believe we found this in a book laying around inside a spaceship, but you never know.
I'm glad you brought that up because amongst the files that Bob Lazar read, the statement that really gets to me, and you're right about the autopsy, he actually drew it himself as to show what he saw, obviously was his handwriting. But he did say that in the notes, they said that the Zeta Reticulates have been visiting Earth for 10,000 years. Now, again, that's not something I would think we would find written inside a craft, and if it is written in their writing, how are we going to translate it? So it sounds like we had some communication with them.
That's correct. I'm sure, though, by 1941, when the Cape Girardeau crash occurred, I bet there was very little information. It was almost like a fantasy, like Buck Rogers or some sort of sci-fi comic strip you'd read in the paper about men from another planet coming here, and probably people scoffed when they first heard the story. In Cape Girardeau, there was probably 2 responses on the ground to someone saying, I saw this crash, I was there, and I saw these little spacemen. And then one would be that you're crazy, such things don't happen, or the other would be, so you say the military swore you to secrecy and you're still talking about it? So you would have hushed up once again. Either way, you would not come across very well in a conservative town like Cape Girardeau, which had a population of about 20,000 in 1941. And it might have been the same across America. In those innocent days, we didn't know anything about alien visitation or spaceships or that were being observed by other worlds. We were, almost in an infant stage as far as that's concerned.
Oh, we absolutely were. I believe it was Michio Kaku who said the types of civilizations 0, 1, 2, 3, 3 being the most advanced using black holes and galaxies, so on and so forth. We are still at a type 0. Now go
Oh
back
no.
79 years where we're barely a spacefaring nation, going to the moon and back, and that's pretty much it. We haven't laid our boots on Mars yet, at least we don't know for the mainstream. But the point is we're pretty far from creating I think it's called boson Dyson spheres, where they basically create structures around their local star, their sun, to harness that energy. Again, so many things that we can think about the future, but we have to get there. And again, our infancy 80 years ago is so hard to fathom when you look at now. We have the internet, you have iPhones, you have technology, you have basically AI, artificial intelligence, in your hand every time you speak to your iPhone. You ask where it is, you ask which way the wind blows, and things like that I don't think people even 40 years ago could have think of that.
I quite agree, and it was probably over the heads of any scientists at first that they, highly educated men, to take a look at this and say, sheepers, how did this thing fly? Because we had no circular experimental craft in those days, not in the early 40s. It was just probably considered mind-blowing. And what would you think if you were an average citizen or even a scientist looking at this dead alien body? And here's where I'll bring in Art Bell again. Do you remember he had a viewer, or a listener, I guess I should say, who sent him a special photograph of a gray alien in a glass tube that he said he inherited from his father, who worked at Area 51. And inside this glass tube is this eerie creature that matches exactly the Cape Girardeau description of the big bulbous head, big black eyes, the 3 fingers, the long, skinny arms and legs. It's just, I should have sent you a photograph before the show to see if this jogged your memory. Does that sound familiar?
Actually, it does. I'm glad I'm picturing it right now. Isn't there silver bands at 3 points across the glass that's holding the tube where the being is in?
Yeah, something like that. Or maybe one holding his arm or his wrist inside the tube. But, boy, that sure looks and sounds like what was described. And there's an important part of the story that we haven't gotten to, is that according to Charlotte Huffman Mann, her grandmother said her grandfather told the family that night when he got home from the crash that there were these farmers who picked up the extraterrestrial, one of the 3 dead bodies, and held him up for a photograph. And someone pulled out a Brownie camera and snapped a picture real quick of the 2 men holding up this creepy-looking alien with his arms outstretched and these dead-looking black eyes. It looked like a rubbery doll almost. And she said a couple weeks after the crash, the man who took the photograph walked up to our house in Cape Girardeau and said, look, I've got this photo. I want you to have a copy. I don't know what else to do with it. And I think he was afraid of the military coming in, the FBI, and stealing his negatives or his files. And so he handed a copy. The pastor apparently didn't really want it, but he brought it in and gave it to his son, and they stuck it somewhere like a drawer or a shoebox. Well, about fast forward 10 years later, and Charlotte was a little girl in a small town in Kansas in those days, and the family would pull out the photo and whisper about it, and she got about a dozen glimpses of it over the years and asked, what's this? What's this creature? And they wouldn't give her a straight answer. They felt like they shouldn't tell a little girl who might go around telling people, and that's kind of understandable. But she said it had the typical big black eyes and grayish silvery body with wrinkly skin, and it was propped up by these 2 local men, and she got a look at that thing. She knows what she saw. Unfortunately, a man from across the street came over for dinner one night and said, I used to be in I think the military. He was in, actually it turned out he was in Army intelligence, big surprise here. He knew something about photography, and he had a friend who knew something about zoology, and he says, I'll take this photograph here, and I'll return it later. Let me show it to my friend. Well, the guy and the photograph disappeared. The guy skipped town, and the family never saw the photo again. Late in life, this man named Walter Fisk was found living near Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he gave a number of different answers. Well, I never saw the photo, and well, he admitted he had the photo, but he gave it back, or some nonsense like this. And he apparently knew much more, and there was a background where he may well have been in the media covering the White House for years, possibly as a spy for Army intelligence. There's a whole fascinating chapter on that, first brought out by a Southeast Missouri resident living in Ohio at the time named Linda L. Wallace, and she tried to put some of her material together in a book called Covert Retrieval, and I certainly recommend that to this day.
You know, the fact that this happened and that gentleman, Walter, what was his last name that you said that lived by Kirtland?
Walter Fisk. He was an elderly gentleman who lived like a mile from Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, and he died in an Army hospital, I think, down there, military hospital.
When JFK was killed, everybody, no matter whether you lived in the United States or elsewhere, you knew exactly where you were when it happened. I would think an event like this is so mind-blowing and earth-shattering, you would also remember everything, every single detail. So for him to give different answers clearly shows some deception to me.
Well, Mr. Fisk was not in Cape Girardeau at the time. He lived in a small town in Kansas, but he took off with that photo after hearing the story from the family. This would be around 1952 or 3, and it's interesting to know the military started some sort of project to scoop up and accumulate all evidence of extraterrestrial visitation at that time. It was like a secret project, or at least that's the rumor. It's awfully sketchy. To go back in time to the Huffman family, they moved away during the war in like 1943 or 44, somewhere in there, when one of the sons of Reverend Huffman died in battle in Europe, and he was, Reverend and his family moved to a small town in Oklahoma, and then they eventually moved to Kansas. And like I say, he died in 59, but Charlotte Huffman Mann still will talk about the story at least occasionally. The problem is, if you want to call it a problem, is she's told the truth and she's gotten the facts out. She's not going to change or embellish them, but she's said about all there is that can be said.
Kind of like Bob Lazar, right? He's told his story. Mm-hmm. He can't really say it again. Same thing with Jesse Marcel Jr. Even though he was only a tiny bit of the story when his father brought home the wreckage, he can't say that, well, before he passed away, obviously. How many times can he repeat the story over 60-plus years of his life? And you're right. This is such a small incident. If she, over each time that she told the story, I would think every detail was told over and over. What else is there left to tell?
Right. And Bob Lazar, to his credit, said he was approached by Hollywood producers who wanted to buy his story and make him rich. But every one of them wanted to turn it into a crazy alien invasion movie, fictionalize it, start messing with it. And he said, no, I'm not going to sell out. I'm going to tell you this story, the truth, and then I'm not going to embellish it, and I'm not going to give it away or sell it to someone who's going to ruin it with a dumb Hollywood movie that twists people's minds about it. So good for him.
I agree with that. You're absolutely right. They would have Hollywoodized it in such a way that it would have added fumes for the skeptics, or fuel for them to say, oh, he's faking it, or it was all a lie. He did it for money. So the fact that he stuck with his guns and still sticks with his guns, and he is a scientist. Anyone who says he's not and goes and visits him in Michigan, United Nuclear is his store, and says he doesn't run a scientific store and doesn't know what he's talking about, or didn't work at Los Alamos, again, it's kind of mind-blowing. I know I've done a lot of investigation on him. And poor Stanton, before he passed away, I live not too far from Pierce College, and when Stanton Friedman said he only found the Pierce College record, now I could tell you from my own personal life that I didn't do very well in high school, but I did very well in junior college, and that's why I ended up in a good law school. Now, if Bob Lazar went to high school and didn't do so well, but he excelled at Pierce, well, then he probably had a really good chance in getting into Caltech and MIT.
Well, I'm glad Dr. J is in the land of show business in Hollywood, and he'll send some producers my way to get the Cape Girardeau story purchased and on the big screen soon. I'm counting on you to come through for all America and the civilized world.
I actually know somebody that I'm going to approach after this. You might know this person. It's Paul Daniels. He wrote the Roswell movie, produced and directed it from 1998. With Martin Sheen?
I've seen that. Has that got Martin Sheen in it?
That's the one, yes.
I thought they did overall a pretty darn good job of that. They tried to recreate and not get too carried away.
And they stayed within the limits of the era. Now we're talking 22 years later, they can go more into detail about the truth. I know there were some limits, like at the end of the story, they had to put the what if it was fake.
Yeah.
It's kind of sad that that's kind of happened. And, with Travis Walton, now we're talking about movies for a quick second. Travis Walton, when he sold his rights, he said they really mumbled it. I'll give you an example. If you remember the movie Fire in the Sky, there's a scene where they put this latex over his face and body and he can't breathe. Well, according to Travis, that never happened, but that was only there to illustrate that he couldn't breathe.
I was disappointed in that movie. They fictionalized it. They made it kind of weird. It just wasn't his tale exactly. They could have done a better job. I think the movie kind of bombed. But they did a pretty fair job for that. I think it was made for Showtime, the Roswell movie.
Yes, it was.
And they showed the meeting of Majestic 12 and James Forrestal, and they, I thought, for probably a small budget, they did a pretty darn good job. The Cape Girardeau story is equal in my eyes. There's one aspect of it I have heard about, and I really haven't found any confirmation that we haven't talked about. But a gentleman told me that there was a second crash that night in the Cape Girardeau area, an upscale neighborhood then, and even more so now. A small amount of material came down. Now, in talking to Linda Moulton Howe, she said Roswell was two crashes, and one of them was felt by investigators in documents. They talk about this, that there was a kind of special escape pod or module that came down about a few miles from the crash. Like on their way down, something ejected, maybe with bodies or not, I don't know. But in Cape Girardeau, it might have been the same thing. However, I couldn't go investigate. This is such an upscale neighborhood. It was like no trespassing signs, private property, keep out. I talked to a gentleman who's into metal detection, and he said he'd already tried to go to this house where allegedly they found things and ask if he could metal detect for Native American artifacts, and then they would told him, no, you're not digging up our yard, now beat it. So that was kind of a dead end for that. But it's just a story, but it might have been exactly like the Roswell case, again, 6 years earlier.
Now, one question that I've been hearing from a lot of people about Roswell and about Cape Girardeau and about crashes in general. If these craft are using gravity to propel themselves, why do they crash so often when they come to Earth, which has natural gravity?
Yeah. Well, first, we have pilots who are highly trained and highly skilled, and we teach them about our weather patterns and gravitational fields and electromagnetics and all that good stuff, and they still crash. But they are trained in the ways of what they could expect here in America and on the face of the earth. Aliens come from a different world. They've got different technology. They may know nothing about electromagnetic fields, gravity, our weather patterns, and downdrafts and thunderstorms and such. And that's one of the tales of the Roswell crash. I understand it might have been a violent electrical thunderstorm that night. That might have zapped a spaceship, just a random blast of lightning. Well, I don't think that's what happened in Cape Girardeau. It was a pretty warm, clear night, but it was unusually windy that weekend in Cape Girardeau with a high in the low 80s, which was very unusually warm. So what happened in Roswell, I don't know, to cause that crash, but that's one theory anyway.
We know, well, at least from Bob Wood and his son Ryan Wood, who you mentioned earlier, and they're great people. I've spoken to them several
Right.
times. That the MJ12 documents, according to Bob Wood, are authentic. He still says they are, and I tend to agree with it. I would think that there are some sorts of records like that. And going back to that era where you didn't it's put things in computers, putting eyes only on and the captions for something classified sounds plausible. Now, if Majestic 12 was founded after Roswell, 6 years after Cape Girardeau, was it already in the works after Missouri, or did it happen more than once where by the time Roswell happened, they said, okay, now we need to deal with this in case something happens in the future?
Right. That sounds probably accurate. If you go to Ryan Wood's website, majesticdocuments.com, it's fascinating. There's a motherload of documents, quite fascinating, that he has been sent or uncovered and authenticated, and he goes through the process of what he used to determine if it's genuine or not, and he puts this material up for anyone to see, and it's just wonderful. Well, one of the reports they have is General Nathan Twining's white-hot report from the September, late summer of 1947. They're assessing what was found in the desert of New Mexico outside of Roswell and Corona and such, and they said the materials were deemed to be extraterrestrial in nature when compared to the Missouri recovery of 1941. Well, bingo! What else could that be? They had to have been referencing, and in a second time, the Missouri's case of 1941. They reference it a second time in these 47 documents. So that's how they knew Roswell was alien, from another world, from the Cape Girardeau crash. They used it to compare. And so this was part of Majestic 12 was put together by Harry Truman when he was in power after Cape Girardeau. He was not president. He was just a senator in those days. And the Cape crash was pretty much hushed up in very tight conditions, and they didn't form a committee to look into this. So Harry Truman did, after Roswell, like you say, let's find out what's going on. And I find that March 1948 Aztec, New Mexico landing crash, if you want to call it that, even more fascinating. This was a big intact crash, apparently, or intact ship that they found in a canyon in New Mexico, and there were dead bodies and apparently live ones that had a suspended state in these chambers were being kept alive, and that's a whole other tale, and that would have been something Majestic 12 would have been very much a part of investigating for the president. What in the world was going on? Everyone wanted to know.
You know, I'm glad you brought up Aztec. I have a question to ask you that I've read from Preston Dennett's book, UFOs over New Mexico. He's done a few states, obviously. And he said that in the Aztec 1948 crash, when they first came upon, well, not when they first came, but when they started going into the craft and looking at the beings and stuff, they found animal and human body parts. That
Ooh.
blew my mind. That I come to think of mutilations and things like that. I just wonder if you've heard anything about that.
Not in the Cape Girardeau crash. I haven't heard that. It wouldn't surprise me because there was a great deal of livestock out in the countryside in all of these farms in 1941, and it would have been ripe for the picking. No one was expecting any sort of extraterrestrial theft and organ removal, but if that happened, I'm not aware of it. But certainly we have heard through the wonderful work of Linda Moulton Howe in uncovering these stories from the American West of cattle being mutilated, their organs removed, and now the idea that an alien craft would crash with these materials inside, these organ samples, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And I'm glad you keep referencing Linda. She's such a good friend of mine. And from all the people that I've interviewed, she's one of the people that I stay in contact with regularly because she's so on the point as far as reporting. If you checked her website, Earth Files Every Day, or her YouTube channel, it's always groundbreaking and new. And that's one thing I love about her. She likes to verify everything. And I tend to take what she says with a lot of strength and apply it. And with historians such researches yourself, because now that we have almost 80 years past this event, and a lot of the people involved have passed away and have passed on their story, there's not much that the people that would prosecute the case can do to their loved ones. What are they going to do? Go to Charlotte and say, we're going to arrest you for talking about what your grandfather said?
Yeah. Not only are all the old witnesses from 1941 long since gone, and in my research, I kept finding that their children were already passed on. So that made the story even tougher to put together. We would have grandchildren, and here's an example real quick. I went to YouTube, and it was talking about UFO crashes in this video, and one person says, whenever we went to Cape Girardeau to visit my grandparents, they would talk about this Cape Girardeau UFO crash of 1941. Matter of fact, it was almost nothing to talk about this what was to us an historic, exciting event, and they just talked about, there was this crash, and I thought, I can't wait to get a hold of these people and interview them and find out every detail. And I went back like the next day or two, and the YouTube video was gone and all the comments gone. So I felt frustrated, but that gives another example. A woman I talked to from a small town just outside Cape Girardeau, not far from what was probably the crash area, said, my mother and my grandmother also spoke in such a manner, very matter of fact, and might have made a light joke here and then when I was growing up. She said, I didn't really pay too much attention to them at the time, and she says, boy, I wish I had paid attention and gotten every detail. What was this about? But once again, it points to this was a real event. And then in those days, they didn't know what to make of it, so they called it little spacemen in their spaceship. And that they didn't use the term ET, I was told, or UFO, or even really alien. It was just little men or little spacemen.
Interesting, and going back to 1941, if you were living in Missouri, in Cape Girardeau, and you heard about this, and being in the midst of a war, a decade after the recession, or 12 years after it started at least, you're still dealing with the repercussions from it. I could see how people compartmentalized that case and sort of put it away, say, we got more important things to deal with on Earth right now.
Yes, and World War II scattered Cape Girardeau residents across the globe to fight the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. And as an example, the chief of police from 1941 died in the Pacific fighting in the battle of, I forget which battle, but against the Japanese. He didn't come home, obviously. So there's an example of future or later events just really helping to wipe out the story a little more, that some of the witnesses were moving away, forgetting about it, or dying off. And here we are to this day. It's all a little sketchy, and I admit there's third-hand, second-hand stories, third-hand, a little hearsay, but when you put together all the clues, like I did for my first book, and I had so much material, I produced a second book in 2016 that I just challenge anyone open-minded to read all of this material and say that it didn't happen. You know in your heart that it did.
Oh, absolutely. And, it was the 2007, the 60th anniversary, when History Channel had a few specials. First they started with Roswell, and then they went to Texas Roswell, then they went to Mexico's Roswell, then they went to British Roswell. And that's what got me to start looking more in crash and retrievals. And I was blown away to find that they not only happened in the last 100 years, but it seems to me that we've had crash and retrievals around the globe for as long as history goes, as far back as history goes.
We may well have, before the military really became a powerful force, the government became kind of like big government and would step in and do things in the name of national security. But where would these materials be? Let's say in the 1700s, the 1800s, where is this crash recovery unless intelligence forces in later decades came in and took it, and it's been stashed away? I'd like to think the Cape Girardeau material was possibly the first on American soil, but I can't say for sure.
It's the one that I've heard the most evidence for. I've heard about one in Texas, in Aurora, Texas, I believe
Right.
1898, but I didn't hear too many details other than it was a solo pilot and it was buried in a well and the grave marker was moved in the 70s. But those are sort of the sketchy stories I've heard, which are here and there, unlike the Cape Girardeau incident.
Right. The late, great Jim Mars did a lot of investigating. That was his home state of the 1897 Aurora, Texas crash. There's very little doubt something happened. But I'll point out that Bill Burns, a UFO investigator, looked into the Aurora case and found insufficient evidence. He said, I just can't find any evidence that this was extraterrestrial. And Kevin Randles, the UFO investigator and author, said the same exact thing. I just can't declare this was an alien event. Kevin Randles found out that the American Army was experimenting with metal-clad balloons in those days, like at Fort Hood or Fort Worth, and that one of them might have got loose and gone astray and crashed. That's a possibility, but it's a little sketchy. It's a fascinating story, but there's here are two UFO researchers who would love to dig into this and find an extraterrestrial story they can write about and maybe get the rights to a movie or something, and they said they really don't think there's anything there.
You know, and with Bill Burns going there, I believe he brought History Channel, so he had a budget to actually look with metal detectors.
Yeah, right.
So, now, earlier you mentioned that there was a communications department in Cape Girardeau, right?
Well, there was the Cape Fire Department and the Cape Police Department actually shared the same building. Today it's still there, but it's a museum. In those days, the firemen and the police mingled together. So if a call came in for the police, the fire department found out pretty quick, and vice versa. So they they probably started placing calls to local doctors and nurses to what they thought at the time was an airplane crash. We've got to get there and help any, like the pilot and the crew or the passengers, to get medical help. And everyone was expecting that. And in Cape, it was a very conservative Christian community. You would have naturally called a pastor, at least one, like Reverend Huffman. So it made perfect sense for them to go speeding out to the crash. It was something to do on a Saturday night. Cape didn't have a whole lot of things to do in those days. There weren't very many places to go. It's a little better today, but in those days, a plane crash, you would have gone out there just to gawk if you could find it. And of course, if you heard a rumor that it was an alien crash, you really would have run out there to take a look. So people were good-hearted then. They would have rushed to the aid of what they thought were going to be mangled victims on the ground, I'm sorry to say, or dead bodies. So that would have been another reason to call in a justice of the peace to make sure bodies and materials like luggage or possessions were being properly handled and not stolen by souvenir hunters or desecrated in any way. So the story makes sense over and over when you piece it together.
When you mentioned that Reverend Huffman, when he first looked inside the craft and he saw hieroglyph-looking symbols, did he ever say to his granddaughter before he passed away in 1959 that when he looked at, say, Egyptian hieroglyphs or Sumerian or cuneiform or anything like that, that the symbols that he saw inside the disc looked like a particular language that we know?
Not to my knowledge. Remember that Reverend Huffman refused to talk about the story from the night of the crash. He came home, told his family, and then he clammed up for the rest of his life from 1941 to 1959. He did tell his wife the night of the crash, and she relayed those details only in the early 1980s when she was ill to her granddaughter. So it's difficult to get a grasp on what exactly he saw in detail, like what kind of hieroglyphic type writing. He didn't say literally hieroglyphics. It just kind of looked like that from his description. Like pictograms, I think, would be another term for it that we would use today. It's baffling. But here's another interesting story. I checked on Topics, which has an online forum about UFOs and UFO crashes, and they started in on the Cape Girardeau crash. And a gentleman wrote that his grandparents owned and farmed the land where the crash occurred. He didn't want to give his name or his grandparents' name, but he wrote online that they talked a little bit about it, and they got him intrigued and refused to talk more, like they were still scared. They didn't want the story getting out. They didn't want themselves, the grandparents, getting into trouble. They didn't want their son or daughter or grandson to get into trouble. Well, he was so intrigued, he took a flight to Cape Girardeau and went looking for the crash site, the farm that was sold after World War II. And he found a gentleman who bought the farm, pardon the expression, and the gentleman was still living there, still working on the land when he went to visit. It must have been in like the 1990s, getting pretty old. And he said the farmer told him, I was going to dig a cistern, like a reservoir for water, rainwater, in the soil. And I started digging up all this metallic shards with strange imprints, like pictograms or hieroglyphics on them, strange symbols that he couldn't make out. He said these metallic shards were very lightweight, and yet he couldn't cut them with any cutters found on the farm. And he couldn't bend it permanently or crease it permanently. They'd always snap back. And he said he collected it all and kept it in a box in his barn. And then he tore the barn down and built something new. And the young man who was looking into this story said the farmer would not tell me what he ultimately did with the debris, which would be, priceless today, unless the military got a hold of it first and scared him.
Yeah.
But he said this matches the story, what Reverend Huffman said, strange hieroglyphic type pictograms or symbols on this metal from a crash. He said the gentleman farmer said he was never told about any spaceship crash when he bought the land. So this was a big surprise for when he was digging in the dirt and found this stuff.
One really intriguing detail about what you just mentioned is the description of the materials is identical to what Jesse Marcel Sr. said about Roswell. He talked about the memory metal. If you creased it, it would snap back. He couldn't cut it. He took a sledgehammer to it. They tried to burn it and nothing. And by the way, it was extremely lightweight.
There's a former Wright-Patterson Air Force Base office employee named June Crane who said the same thing. She said an Army or Air Force officer came in one day and showed her this strange metallic alien-type material that she couldn't cut or bend or fold with a crease, and it always snapped right back. So that, again, confirms three different tales that this extraterrestrial craft material is something quite extraordinary, and we probably can't reenact it or, recreate it to this day.
At least, right? I mean, and who knows if these civilizations have 1,000 years, 100,000 years, a million years ahead from us. So I don't think we're going to be seeing these materials replicated with Earth-like materials. And if they even can, we might not even have the materials to make them, let alone the processes. Now, let me go back to the hieroglyphs for a second. This is more of an opinion question to ask you. The reason why I'm always so curious about the hieroglyphs is because if we, meaning humanity, use them in the past, I've always wondered, is the reason why the Egyptians used hieroglyphs that looked similar to the pictographs that people have reported on these ET craft, is it because the ancient Egyptians, ancient Greeks, Sumerians, anybody from that era saw these hieroglyphs or pictograms on the craft that they were possibly interacting with? Is that how the human letters, or not the English alphabet, but the Egyptian alphabet was created, or was it vice versa? Or is it just pure coincidence? That's always something that, I puzzle in my mind to wonder what if. Of course, your imagination can take you anywhere, but it's always something interesting that I'd hope to one day find the answer to.
Yeah, it's a very intriguing theory. And who knows, it could be partially true or entirely true. They used little images to express themselves, and they had a great interest in the stars. They are opening up tombs in Egypt, and they've got little stars all over the ceiling, and they were interested in formations of the stars, what we would call astrological formations, I think, or the Cirrus and Canis Major and all that sort of thing, and their position, and they align quite well with the pyramids themselves. That's subject matter that's a little out of my league, but I have seen some material on television and in books on that. So if you were to take the planet Earth and its 7 continents and flatten them out, and on the face of the surface, put them together, the Great Pyramids land exactly in the exact epicenter of the planet. And it's strange that apparently other pyramids fall along that same equatorial line, or latitude, or which is it, longitude?
Yeah,
It goes,
longitude is vertical, latitude is horizontal. I believe.
It's pretty creepy, wild stuff that we're all still learning about. Stuff like Ancient Aliens on the History Channel, which did a bit on my book and showed its cover. Thank you very much. They're uncovering and they're putting the story together and raising people's consciousness about how we may well have been visited for many thousands of years, millennia. We're being observed, and we're like a crude race of stumbling fools that have found atomic power, and now we're polluting the planet unlike any time before. And it's kind of depressing the way we've treated each other and our planet, and yet extraterrestrials don't seem to do too much to step in and interfere, do they?
You're absolutely right. And it begs the question that does it take something major for them to interfere, such as maybe destroying us all in multiple volcanoes? You're absolutely right. How much do we have to cause harm on this earth? How many species have to become extinct before they do something?
I would think that they might even let us blow ourselves up and just say, well, too bad for you. We came to observe, not to get involved. It's like in Star Trek, Captain Kirk and his crew have the prime directive, observe but don't get involved. And naturally, almost every episode they break that rule and get involved in some sort of alien race of human-like creatures as they go through space. But it might be something very close to that look but do not touch.
I've heard from a few people, again, this is just a theory from people that have been abducted, that when they ask ETs, now the reason why I say it's just a theory because people are in a hypnotic state when they're taken, especially when they undergo hypnotic regression, and who knows if the ETs are lying. The reason I say that is you go to the airship mystery of the late 1800s. They said they're from out west. You go to the George Adamski years, they're from Venus. Each decade they seem to be coming from somewhere else.
Yeah.
That's why I say they lie. So again, that just begs the question of how much information can we actually get from the people who are interacting with them. And the thing that I've heard a common theme is that they're supposedly not supposed to interfere with us on a macro level. Apparently, we're supposed to get to this level, not a type 1 civilization, where we meet them and then we could start interacting with them. Otherwise, they have to stay from afar and observe. I've heard that time and time again. Can we prove it? Unfortunately, no.
You are familiar with the work of the late Robert O. Dean?
Yes.
He said he got peeks over and over at this highly classified, above top secret survey of the extraterrestrial situation in Europe in the early 60s. And what he found was there were some attempts by aliens, friendly ones, to land at airfields, possibly in like England or Italy, and to do some amount of communicating with humans. We're making such a mess of the planet, but otherwise we've got plenty of evidence that we are being visited. Autopsy photos, measurements of organs he read, various crashes in Europe. This was largely a study done by Army intelligence with MIT and Cambridge and Oxford scientists, and he said he got peeks at it in the middle of the night when there was no one around and would scribble notes in the bathroom. But I believe his story, and I think it's a case of at least 4, 7, 10 maybe different races are coming here to observe us, and some are a little more friendly than others, and there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. You just have to go about your business in life and realize that, yeah, we're being watched and they don't care to talk to us too much.
I'm glad you brought up Robert Dean. He's a very fascinating man. Unfortunately, he's another one that we've talked about that has passed. And I had a fortunate time to interview him back in
Oh, good.
2012. And, his story that he worked at Shape in Paris, the details he knows and was able to repeat over the decades, again corroborates a lot of the stories that we heard from the mainland United States.
Right. One of the creatures, he said, that are visiting us are an extraterrestrial race that look like, almost like dinosaurs or reptiles. And he said the study that he read showed that if there were dinosaurs on another planet and they managed to evolve without extinction, like a meteorite or a volcanic event that killed off the race of dinosaurs that they did on here, on this planet, that they would have looked just like the aliens he saw in these images in the highly classified report that he got to read. And it just kind of makes your skin crawl. And another one was a race of beings that looked a lot like humans. And then, of course, there were your proverbial grays, these little gray doll-like creatures. And the whole thing made his skin crawl, I'm sure, but it's more mainstream and accepted, I think, nowadays, these descriptions and what's going on.
The human-looking aliens are the ones that scare me the most. From afar, we could see a dinosaur-looking reptilian or a short gray with a big head or pale skin, but those that look identical to us, wear our clothes, possibly live next door, those are the ones that scare me the most.
Yeah. If they are human-like or they can assume our form, who knows where they're going? Into the Pentagon, into the White House, into the Kremlin, into your bedroom, your boardroom, your bathroom. It's a little frightening, but life goes on, and they haven't done anything hostile yet, to our knowledge.
That's true. That's true. Now, also something I meant to ask that I'm seeing here about the Reverend Huffman in Cape Girardeau, when he came upon that being that he started praying over the being's body before it passed away, did the being send any telepathic messages to him?
Apparently not. I don't recall reading that as part of the story as what Charlotte Huffman Mann has described. I think there was some of that in that Roswell movie, wasn't there? When an actor portraying James Forrestal goes to an underground facility to see an actual alien creature that's being kept in a locked room, and he looks through a window, and he gets mental messages from that creature. And that was a very effective scene. They did a very good job. To my knowledge, that did not happen in Cape.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that scene up. You're right. It was very effective. It's almost that last 30 seconds or 60 seconds with the actor playing James Forrestal goes to that room where it's like a hospital bed sort of. That almost in that 30 seconds to 60 seconds sums up the entire movie better than the entire movie for myself.
I agree. More are coming, and he finds out that various races, various species, they're coming here, and there's nothing we can do about it. And it isn't meant as a hostile warning of future wars or anything like that, but it's just an awakening that you have to wake up, and there are various creatures on other planets who are far more advanced than we are, and we are probably far more advanced than other life forms on other planets. The cosmos is this incredibly vast in its creation and the various galaxies and superclusters of galaxies, and we can't even begin now with all our great technology to map out a fraction of the known cosmos. Here's one mind-blowing fact you hear from scientists. There are more stars in the known universe than there are grains of sand on all the beaches on the planet Earth to put together. That's just astounding if you've ever been to the seashore.
Oh, that's mind-blowing. And considering the Kepler telescope in the last maybe decade or more has found a lot of exoplanets, and I think the current estimate is there are 1.3 planets per star because there's some stars that have no planets. Well, then that raises the number of grains of all the sands in the world if they represented planets to more than what we have.
Yeah, it's just almost mind-boggling. It's almost too much to grasp for our puny little brains, but we're making some advances. And like I said, modern TV shows are helping to opening minds, and internet websites and magazines, newspapers, movies, the Sci-Fi Channel. You ever turn it on, and there's all kinds of wild alien stuff going on there, whether it's fictionalized or they base some of it on real-life stories. And, of course, there was Project Blue Book, which looked at the history of Ellen J. Hynek, although they fictionalized that a little bit there, didn't they, for Hollywood's sake?
Yeah, I feel sorry for his son who has to watch it now because yeah, you're right. They could have done a better job because it's History Channel. These are the guys that brought us ancient aliens. How could they bungle that?
They have at one point Hynek, I think, looking out of an airplane and seeing a spaceship himself. Apparently he never saw anything. And I'll emphasize, I've never seen a UFO either, nothing out of the ordinary. I'm from a bit of a skeptical or cynical family, and even I feel like, the Cape Girardeau story is true. I don't believe everything I've heard or read in life. I'm not a gullible fool. And I'm a bit skeptical when I see the latest claims on the internet. But even I believe we are being visited, and there's not much we can do about it.
I'm sure you've heard this is just about ETs in general. I think this was on the news yesterday. Scientists now say or estimate that in our galaxy alone, there is a conservative number, a very low number being very conservative. There's at least a minimum of 36 advanced extraterrestrial intelligent species that could possibly communicate with us. And that number can be as high as 500 or 1,000. For mainstream science to say that openly was kind of shocking to me because it didn't have, Michael Shermer saying, "Oh, that's not true," or thing like that.
Everything's not true to Michael Shermer.
Yeah.
There's value in skeptics as long as they're reasonable and even-handed about things and admit that they could be wrong. But so many skeptics are, no, that didn't happen. That's not true. The Philip class, all of this is a lie. Your opinion is almost valueless when you deny everything and without reading or learning or thinking about the vastness of the universe and how we could be a very fascinating race to other beings to come here and observe what we're doing to the planet, which is not good to say the least.
Yeah.
You have to be open-minded. A skeptic is fine as long as you listen and learn a little first.
I put skeptics in two different categories. First, we have the Michael Shermers, Philip Klass, Robert Schaefer, who I've used Robert Schaefer. I'm friendly with him. I've hosted a bunch of debates with him and Stanton Friedman, him and Richard Dolan, etc. But those types of skeptics, I wouldn't consider skeptics as much as I would say they have an agenda. An agenda to say no matter what happened, it isn't true. The other side, I put the healthy skepticism, such as yourself, such as myself, where you take everything with a grain of salt and you try to confirm it, but you're still open-minded. We, on the other hand, can look at something and determine if it's true or not. They look at it, no matter what is possibly true, they will say it's not.
I've been on the internet and I've read quotes from people who are at the opposite end of the scale. They'll believe any story, any tale. It's like, oh, have you seen this? This has got to be true. This is all part of the alien agenda. And it's something that's easily debunked, like somebody's video they made in their backyard or something like that. We can't be the opposite and just immediately grasp everything as extraterrestrial. Dr. Carl Sagan had an interesting quote, and it still resonates today. He said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, he knows darn well that the Army and the government keeps taking away the evidence and hushing us to secrecy. So we've had some extraordinary claims, such as the Roswell case where the Army came out and admitted right off the bat, we found an alien disc, and then they changed their story once it went up the chain of command and people kind of panicked. You shouldn't have said that. Let's say it was a weather balloon. And so the story changed again. But it was the Army that initially told us this was an extraterrestrial craft that we found.
I think that's what makes the Roswell case so fascinating, more so than other cases, is the fact that it was the military that found it and issued that press release. It wasn't until it made its way at the chain of command they said, nope, cut the story. Here's the cover story. It's a weather balloon. And that's why even this day, 73 years later, it still stands the test of time. Now, back to Carl Sagan for a second. Again, this is to ask your opinion because I've always thought this myself. Being the lead astronomer that he was in that era, I'm talking about the 80s and the 90s and the 70s even, I would think he would be somebody that they would pull into the program. Of course, we can never find this out because I don't think he told anybody, and he died an untimely death, I believe, from cancer. And he wrote a lot of skeptic type things, but at the same time, he also, drew pictures of what could be living on, Europa or other moons of different planets, and just was very open-minded. But at the same time, if he heard someone giving a description of a craft that flew faster than the speed of sound and didn't make a sonic boom, just completely discounted it. And that let me mention that as well to SETI. Seth Shostak, I speak to him fairly regularly. It doesn't matter how much evidence someone has, he does not want to hear it. And I don't understand why.
Remember that Dr. Donald Menzel was part of MJ-12. He was a Harvard astronomer, and he denied everything and put out all kinds of explanations for UFOs. And Dr. Friedman, God bless him, he dug into those explanations and found almost every one of them were totally bogus. And this was like kind of cover story so that he could say I was a skeptic, but he was actually working for MJ-12 and keeping the lid clamped down because the government did not want us to know in those days that, yes, we are being visited, we are being observed. They were afraid of a panic, and that was another reason to cover up Cape Girardeau. It came just a few years after the War of the Worlds radio broadcast, in which a few people, not a lot, did panic and called police stations and ran out into the street looking for space aliens that had come from the sky when it was just an H.G. Wells play that was being broadcast, and it was nothing to be afraid of. And they would even, during the radio broadcast, I think in 1938 actually, they would say, this is a radio play, this is not real, and people still would flood the local police department with calls, are we being invaded, that sort of reaction. So I think the Army and the government were afraid that people would panic and really run into the street or have heart attacks or barricade themselves in with weapons if they heard about the Cape Girardeau or New Mexico crash, and they might still have somewhat this mindset to this day. My opinion of Dr. Carl Sagan went downhill fast when my cousin told me he was attending Cornell University in Upper New York State, and he was part of a fraternity, and they lived right next door to Dr. Sagan's office, and they thought, hey, it would be great to invite him over for dinner and get to know him. So they were just trying to be friendly, and Dr. Sagan came over, had a nice meal, and talked to the college kids, and then a few days later he sent them a bill for thousands of dollars for a personal appearance fee. Oh. And so, how pompous and out of touch are you if you're going to send some college kids who were just trying to be friendly, you expect them to pay several $1,000s worth of personal appearance costs just to come to dinner.
That's arrogance. That's definitely arrogance. Yeah. And if I had known that, obviously my opinion of him would have definitely deflated by that.
Egg his house to start with.
Now, going back to the H.G. Wells War of the Worlds broadcast in 1938, as you told it, you're absolutely right. People heard that, the fact that it was a radio broadcast, yet others tuned in late and didn't hear the fact that it was a play that he was orating. Right. And they did die. Some actually died in heart attacks. Now, fast forward to now. Do you think now, because then we weren't in the middle of the war yet, but the German theater was just starting to take off in 1938. This was pre-war era. I could see why they wanted to keep things more secret and more focused on what we're doing here on Earth. Here we are in 2020. We're not quite at war, but at the same time, our relations with China aren't the best. Do you think that people would react the same way as they did 82 years ago? Or do you think that, maybe they'll be more open-minded because our technology is not that far off?
Yeah, if somebody landed and from another world and spoke without weaponry and was friendly, unarmed, I think we would handle it very excitedly and very openly. Or if a ship crashed, I think it would be somewhat the same way. We are conditioned now to decades and decades of situation comedies like My Favorite Martian and Mork and Mindy, and other programs that talk about aliens visiting, Steven Spielberg's movies, Close Encounters, and other films like E.T. I think people would be very fascinated and excited and would not panic at all. There might be a flow of people trying to get to the landing site or the crash site, and they got to see it in person, and they just got to touch the craft or something like that. That would be a real security nightmare, like maybe over 1 million people charging up to take a look, take video images with their cameras. But I don't think a horrifying panic would ensue. Maybe there would be a couple of heart failures, but overall, I think we would handle it much better now.
I agree with you, and the media will definitely blow it up. They'll take advantage of it. It'll be on every newspaper, every website, but the story will die down. The zoo effect of people wanting to touch it, photograph it, will die down eventually, and we'll get back to paying the bills or eating or whatever else we need to do to survive here on Earth. Okay, we got ETs, they got technology, they're visiting us, but we still got to live.
That's quite true. We have to get on with life. You can't just quit college, quit school, quit your job, and go in search of aliens or go plan a trip across the country to where a creature came down and landed and said hello. You've got to get back to business and accept things like mature, rational, responsible adults, but we sometimes don't have that in this country. We act a little crazy now and then, but overall, I think people would handle it much, much better than the people of the early 40s or even the late 40s and early 50s.
One thing I forgot to ask you that I'm also seeing here that I should have asked earlier is the standing order, I don't know if it was the 40s or the 50s, of shoot them down, where we were telling, I'm talking, when I say we, I'm talking about the upper brass of our military, was telling the pilots to shoot down these ET craft. Do you think that the Cape Girardeau incident was possibly shot down, or did the witnesses, or lack of witnesses, tell you that there weren't any human aircraft in the area?
Right. I'm pretty sure in 1941 there were no such orders and no such threat from alien craft and hardly any sightings back then. But it's our mutual pal, Linda Moulton Howe, did excellent research showing that President Truman gave the order, shoot them down. These little buggers don't have our permission to be here. And he thought maybe they would be hostile or they've been ducking around our airplanes. And let's go on the offensive and show them we mean business. And I don't think that lasted too long and was too successful, but it's Linda's research that showed that Truman took a more aggressive stance, and I think he eased off on that before the end of his term and the start of the Eisenhower administration.
Yes, he did ease off it, and one of the reasons I've read from the book Shoot Them Down, whose author I am not remembering at the moment, was because a lot of human pilots died trying to chase these aircraft or spacecraft.
Right. Maybe one of them landed in Kentucky. I forget his name. It was a somewhat famous case in which he was radioing back to headquarters what he was seeing, this strange disc or object in the sky, and he's going to chase after it and get aggressive with it. And he ended up crashing his plane, and who knows how that happened exactly. But we can't paint all extraterrestrials as friendly, can we?
No.
We can't paint them all as unfriendly either. There are probably varying degrees of psychology involved with these species and how they think of us, maybe some quite arrogantly and thinking that we're expendable, and others who think of life as very precious, and plant life, animal life, and human life. And we need more of those around here.
Yes, that's true, and I would think those that could care less or operate in their own manner don't really care what we do as far as what we do with each other, but of course care what we do with the planet, may have come across other civilizations and say, okay, well, they got to do their thing, and if they start destroying the habitat, we will remove them and put something in place that could live there, and we'll go off without our business. Putting ourselves in the mind frame of these ETs opens the door to so many possibilities. But then at the same time, we can never be in their minds because how can we even know how they think?
Yeah, it's tough. We only have to speculate because we average citizens don't know. Maybe someone deep in the government does know, and they're not letting it out, what the psychology or the attitude is of the various races. We can only guess. However, life seems to go on day to day here, and we're not being attacked or invaded. It would be foolhardy for any race to come and invade us now. We're full of germs, bacteria, viruses. We've pretty much stripped the planet of its minerals and its oil and its natural resources. We're making a mess of the oceans. There's almost nothing of great value that they could find here. It would be pointless to invade, so I think we're fairly safe from that. I wish I could come up with something really friendly and wonderful that they've done for us on the opposite end of the scale. I really don't know of anything offhand. Do you?
The only thing I could think of is letting us live. That's pretty much it. The fact that they haven't blown us to bits is the only thing I could think of. I guess if I really thought about it, this is just a guess, going back to the Egyptians or the Mayans, maybe the knowledge they gave to them about astronomy, but that is so limited. They can't say, well, they taught them technology, they gave them materials, they showed them how to create gravity-propelled crafts, because we figured it out for ourselves.
That sounds pretty rational to me. Again, we have to use our best guesses because the military, the government, people in the know won't speak to us, and you kind of wonder, is there disclosure coming? If it is, it might be drip, drip, drip over the past few years, and certainly in the decade to come, the next decade or two. I don't see any official announcement from a president or a vice president or a leading general. Do you?
No, and I'm so glad you came upon this topic because I've wondered, is there ever going to be disclosure? I've been thinking this for 35 plus years. When is it going to happen? And then I started to pay attention to all the books and articles that they allowed to happen, that there was no interference of the TV shows. They're more liberal about what they show us on History Channel now. They don't end with Michael Shermer. For instance, Ancient Aliens was a huge game changer. I'll tell you a quick story about that. I interviewed Giorgio Tsoukalos and Kevin Burns last year, and I told Kevin, I said, you're the creator of Ancient Aliens. Why you're going down as the most successful show ever on History Channel. Why do you think so? He said, it's funny you asked that. He said, Discovery Channel called me after the first season and said, how are you so successful? And what Kevin said was really interesting. He told Discovery, he said, when you produce a documentary on Christianity, do you include skeptics? And that was like that's why they're so successful. And so the fact that that's changed so much is making it more for the youth to believe it. A recent poll is 68% of people believe that there are ETs, and a large percentage of those people believe that we've also been visited. 30 years ago, that number was far less than half. Now, the DoD videos a couple years ago, which were released, in my mind, I think that's the biggest step of disclosure, because just like Roswell, you have the Department of Defense government releasing video and saying, we don't know what these are. These things are faster than ours, but this time they're not retracting it.
That's fascinating that they came out and said that and admitted this. And the Tic Tac story of this strange craft that buzzed around just looked like a big white Tic Tac, and they're willing to admit some of this. So that might be part of a drip-by-drip, slow, mentally breaking us in process of admitting, one of the problems the government faces in any intelligence community is we've all got cell phones and we're taking video of anything wacky or unusual and slapping it on the internet. Here's the latest YouTube videos, and some of this stuff you pretty much are impressed by and you can't deny, and others look like it might be rigged, and other stuff might be CGI. But there's just like a boatload of this stuff now, and how can you just deny everything? It may come down to at some point someone getting their phone out, multiple sources, and capturing a ship coming down and creatures stepping out and moving around and maybe leaving traces of something behind, and you just can't deny it anymore. And it'll be all over the internet, and it'll be quite historic. And there's nothing much the government can do about that, is there?
No, you're absolutely right. And us living in 2020, where everyone has at least one phone in their pocket, which is a high definition, generally a 4K video recorder, is recording them. And like you said, they all can't be drones or CGI. A portion of them have to be real. It's the probability of statistics. And you hear from the witness reports, especially when I hear from a credible person with possible other witnesses, that an object like the Tic Tac UFO traveled faster than the speed of sound, yet did not make a sonic boom.
Wow. That would be hard for us to replicate, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I still don't think it's possible. Now, let me turn to ask you, because I know we got about 15 minutes left, and before I get to the next topic real quick, let me ask you something about Cape Girardeau and your book, the Bombshell Before Roswell. After you published it, did any new witnesses come to you about the Cape Girardeau, Missouri incident?
I got a couple of people who said, my grandmother told me this, my grandfather knew this person who knew that person. Again, secondhand, because everyone's passed away, and it's so difficult to get anything direct. I heard from one person who said my grandmother knew the guy who was working the farm that day, saw the fireball, and called in the crash that he felt was an airplane initially. He was inside the house and went for the phone, and that the fire department did come out, and he talked about it, but that's like a second-hand, third-hand story. I found one confession of sorts quite interesting. It wasn't anyone who was on the ground in Cape Girardeau, but does the name Thomas Cantwheel from Robert Ryan S. Wood material ever mean anything to you?
Yes, I've heard him say that name, but I can't picture from what.
Well, he worked for the Army Counterintelligence Corps and later the CIA. And in the 1990s, this man who had a very reputable career in Army and government intelligence typed up a confession. And he said, I worked for these intelligence bodies, and one of the first things I want to tell you is there was an Aerodyne that crashed in southern Missouri in the 1940s. Gee, what do you think he was talking about? In those days, they called it an Aerodyne, which is a fancy word for an airship or a spaceship. So that was the first thing he wanted to get off his chest. And that's just another clue, another example that we can take this story very seriously, but that the government, probably the CIA, knows a great deal more, and they ain't talking, and we have to get the little dribs and drabs from someone like, what was that fellow's name? He's passed away now. He was like second in command, a deputy at the CIA, and helped Richard Helms.
Oh, no, not Philip Corso you're thinking of.
Victor Marchetti, that's the man's name. He said, it is true from all that I learned in the CIA. We are being visited. The intelligence agencies know this. We're being observed by other races. It's a very serious matter. They take it seriously. It's not a joke. And there's another clue that it's just something to ponder seriously and not as a fantasy anymore.
You know, it's very interesting that the CIA was created in 1947. Maybe you know the month, but I'm assuming after Roswell?
I believe that's correct. And the NSA. President Truman put these government bodies to work. The CIA was born out of the old Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. But like you, I can't remember the precise date. I think it was after the Roswell crash, but certainly the NSA was, National Security Agency.
Yeah, from the National Security Act. Now, we know that FDR and Truman definitely knew about these craft and were briefed. We also know that Eisenhower knew. We also know that Nixon knew because of the story that you probably know this, that he took Jackie Gleason down, was it to Wright-Patterson or Homestead Air Force Base, and showed him one of the bodies in some craft. And they say the reason Richard Nixon knew was because he was vice president to Eisenhower. The question I have for you is at what point did they stop briefing the presidents, in your opinion, or do you think our president now knows what's going on?
According to a brigadier general at the time, Eisenhower was aware of things, and very aware of things, and that's the subject of my latest book that should be out in December. But Steve Lovkin, I think his name was, said that gradually Eisenhower grew more and more frustrated that the ET matter and spacecraft and its assimilation by private companies and the Defense Department was growing more and more out of his hands, and he wasn't being briefed on the matter. And so I think it was a struggle from the late 50s, the 60s, the 70s for the government's head, the president, to know everything that's going on and have some amount of control. The Nixon story with Jackie Gleason I take very seriously, and I include in my book on Eisenhower. It's called President Eisenhower's Close Encounters, and it should be out later this year. It's just an utterly fascinating, exciting story, but it's true that the presidents can only know so much and do so much, and maybe some are much more briefed and informed than others. If you think someone like Gerald Ford, who took over and had only like a year and a half or 2 years as president, you might not tell him anything, expecting him to be turned out in office in the next election, and he was. So why would you brief him? It's just another possible source for leaking things. A president may not always be told what's going on.
And when you have someone like Eisenhower, who was career military, the supreme Allied commander, obviously he knew how to keep secrets, and I would think that's why he would absolutely been briefed. And I'm glad you mentioned the fact that he was frustrated, because there was the story that he wasn't allowed at Area 51, and he threatened to bring the 4th Army Division or the Tank Division to invade, which I thought was really fascinating.
That's a Linda Moulton Howe source of a gentleman she called Cooper Stein. It's in my book. But that President Eisenhower, by the late 50s, again, very frustrated. He wants to know what is going on with these recovered ET materials and possibly with live aliens interacting with military intelligence upper personnel, the cream of the crop in secret at like S4, not quite at Area 51, but out in the Nevada desert. And he was so frustrated and so angry, he said, I want you to take this message back to your boss out at that facility. I am going to get the 5th Army, and I'm going to invade if I have to, lead these troops right up to the door, and we'll blow them open if we have to find out what's going on. So that's a terrific story. If it's true, we have only the one source who told Linda Moulton Howe towards the end of his life that we really are interacting with some friendly aliens and learning about their spaceships and such in a very covert, highly classified program. And this is a little bit of what I touch upon in my new book.
And now let's go into your new book. Now let's fast forward 13 years after 1941 to 1954. We have Muroc Airfield, which is the name prior to Edwards Air Force Base. We have President Eisenhower. I think he was golfing in Palmdale. Maybe I'll let you fill in the story from there.
Right. President Eisenhower could golf anywhere. And he loved going to Augusta, just down the coast from Washington, D.C. to Georgia. He went there so many times, they built him a home on the course, believe it or not. So suddenly, after a hunting vacation, just like 2 days after, in February 54, he has to fly all the way across the United States to go golfing in Palm Springs, California, I beg your pardon. And so he's out there golfing, and it's pretty clear now from my research that this was a well-planned event, that the golfing was a kind of cover story and excuse to be near Muroc and Edwards Air Force Base as we know it today, where a pre-planned event, some amount of communication took place, and aliens that were friendly to us, looking somewhat like human beings, told them in communications that they were going to land and they'd like to talk to Eisenhower face-to-face, a U.S. president. And even though I'm a skeptical source, I've done enough research to believe this really happened. Eisenhower was flown out to the base, and he bravely went forward and met with these creatures who were unarmed and very friendly. They spoke in English, and they told Eisenhower how unhappy they were with our atomic detonations that were poisoning our atmosphere and threatening to get into what we call outer space, and the way we were treating the planet and poisoning and polluting everything. And he did not want to give up our nuclear arsenal. He said, we're not going to unilaterally disarm. Everyone would have to disarm, and of course that's not going to happen. The communist world is not going to just give up their nuclear weapons. So they reached a kind of friendly stalemate. And Eisenhower said, we really can't have your presence open in our society. You're going to have to be very reserved and look and not touch and don't interact with the human race lest you start a panic. So the creatures were friendly and agreed to this, got back in their ship and took off. And President Eisenhower continued his golf vacation, had to put on good public appearance that nothing's wrong, nothing out of the ordinary here, and flew back to Washington. And he may have had a second encounter of the same nature, as I put in my book. If you've ever read the wonderful research of the late Art C. Campbell, does that name ring a bell?
I have not read his work, no.
Art Campbell did research on Holloman Air Force Base, a landing of...
that's California, right? Holloman?
Holloman, yeah, that's in New Mexico.
Okay.
In 1955, Eisenhower was supposed to be on another hunting vacation in Georgia, and he disappeared from that one and apparently took off, according to eyewitnesses, and flew quickly to an air base in New Mexico where he got out and he communicated with friendly human-like extraterrestrials once again. It might have been the completion of a non-interference treaty in which aliens agreed to stay aloof and not land and openly show themselves, and then Eisenhower flew back and no one was the wiser. But Art Campbell put together a pretty good, I don't think he got a book out of it, but he put together a pretty good website, and I think you can check out his information to this day. So that's part of Eisenhower's close encounters, along with his possibly seeing a flying saucer, according to an eyewitness who was there while he was aboard the USS Franklin Roosevelt, steaming off the coast of Europe in early January 1952, the year he decided to run for president. After saying for many years he's not going to run for president, something happened to cause him to change his mind, and we can't really speculate positively that it was seeing this disk for at least up to 10 minutes in a thunderstorm hovering over the Franklin Roosevelt at sea. But according to a 1997 newspaper account, that's just what occurred. And at the time, President Eisenhower told the crew around him on the deck of the ship, this never happened, just keep it to yourselves, and I'll look into it and get back to you. And, of course, he never did.
Yeah, a typical general, right? And I could see how an event like that would be so earth-shattering to him, where he wanted to be the commander-in-chief to maybe make some policy decisions about how to handle this.
It may seem a bit arrogant, but he felt he was the best informed, the best man for the job, and he ran. He was so immensely popular. He won the nomination easily. He won the fall election in a landslide, and he won re-election. So it makes sense for aliens to ask to meet with him. He was the most likely representative, the most powerful, the most popular man on the face of the earth at the time. And apparently everything went well in general, but there may have been an agreement reached that lasts to this day that aliens are not going to land and cause a stir by walking around and trying to talk to us, whether it's in a public park or in front of the White House or at a football game. They're going to remain a bit aloof lest they trigger a possible panic, is what they fear.
With the 1954 meeting at Edwards, formerly known as Muroc, one thing I love about the case as a whole is that not only does it stand the test of time, it seems to me that through the decades, more information has come to corroborate the story as opposed to dismiss it. And one mind-blowing thing that I found was the people that were present with Eisenhower. Did you uncover who else was there?
There's a security team around him that were Georgia State Troopers. What in the world were they doing in Palm Springs, California, or Edwards Air Force Base, California? They were Georgia State Troopers that guarded Eisenhower regularly when he came to play golf. I found in his records they were there. They may have been a special team that assisted the Secret Service and the military in making sure the aliens were friendly, unarmed, and harmless. You would never allow a president to go into a dangerous situation. So there's lots of data on that event, which I feel was February 19th, 1954. And when did President Nixon go to Homestead Air Force Base to inspect extraterrestrial materials? It was February 19th. 1973. I don't think it was a coincidence that he went there on the exact 19th anniversary. So I get into that in my book, and it should be very exciting and a lot of fun to read. And hopefully we can get some sort of TV or movie deal going on that and open people's consciousness and awareness of that story. It's just one of the coolest things, a U.S. president speaking face-to-face with landed aliens.
Well, that's absolutely a story that needs to be told, and if it's put into a movie, visually, it'll do so much more than in books. Now, don't get me wrong, reading it and hearing about it is great, but by putting it in motion picture, it's going to be a game changer. And believe me, I will do my part and try to introduce you to the right people to make this happen, because what I've noticed is from the people involved in Hollywood are finally starting to buy scripts or buy stories on these topics, almost as if they're allowed to. With that being said, when December rolls around, I definitely want to do a show on the Edwards Air Force Base encounter. I think that's going to be mind-blowing. And before you go, also please hang by for a quick moment so I could thank you off air. Let's talk about where we could buy your books, where people can find you, and the names of your books.
The first book on the Cape Girardeau crash is called, as we've mentioned, Mo 41, The Bombshell Before Roswell, and the sequel, 3 Presidents, 2 Accidents, More Mo 41 UFO Crash Data and Surprises. You could normally get that from Argus Books, Argus Publishing, but they've been recently cyber assaulted. They've been held up for ransomware. It's frozen things up, so I recommend you go to Amazon.com and look for my books there. My book on the Eisenhower encounter, or President Eisenhower's Close Encounters, should come out probably through Foundations Publishers in late November or December. I don't believe you can pre-order quite yet, but everything's being set into print and photos collected and everything. So my books are at Argus, or you could look for Amazon.com, and I try to pack as much information into each book so you really feel like you got your money's worth. You know, how many times have you picked up some flimsy paperback on with blaring headlines or titles that mislead you, and there's almost nothing to the story, or the authors did a really crummy job of not researching or investigating? I found that out a few times, and I'm never going to rip off readers. They're going to get their money's worth when they buy anything that I've written.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that sadly has happened to me too many times. That's why I'm really interested in your next book coming out. Now, like I said, hang by for a quick second so I can thank you off air. Before we go, I want you to give a final statement to everybody out there. You could say whatever you want on any topic you want. What would it be?
I would say stay grounded and stay somewhat skeptical, but remain open-minded. And what did Casey Kasem say? Keep your feet on the ground and keep reaching for the stars. I think as we go along in the next decade, we're going to see some more admissions by our government and more disclosure, drip piece by piece, drip by drip. And it should be a fun, exciting time, even though this past year has not been a lot of fun, has it? We've got to be strong and carry on.
Well said, everybody. Paul Blake Smith, and this is Dr. J, host of Dr. J Radio Live, and I'll catch you